Well, in the spirit of taking a look at cars that are coming down in price in the classic car field, we're going to look today at this 1957 Continental Mark II. No, not a Lincoln, but a Continental Mark II. And it's kind of interesting to me. There's a number in particular of Ford products from this era that I'm seeing prices really kind of nosedive on. One, as I previously mentioned, is the 55 to 57 Thunderbird, where you can get, if it's a Thunderbird without a special engine, like a 2.4 barrel powered engine or a supercharged engine, those cars are now going in the mid to high 20s in great shape. And let's say 5 years ago, they were going in the high 30s, mid 40s. And this Continental Mark II is another one that I'm seeing, like I said, come down in price pretty significantly. And I would say this is a beautiful car to buy. It might not be something that's going to surge in value, but it's certainly a gorgeous car. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Continental Mark II. Now you have to remember, at this time frame, General Motors had 5 divisions: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. They were all selling extremely well in the marketplace. And Ford was admittedly a bit jealous of this 5-division strategy. After all, they had Ford, they had Mercury, they had Lincoln. But as 1956 rolled around, they would implement a broadening of their portfolio and introduce the new Continental division to the Ford Motor Company lineup. Of course, observant car lovers will also know that in 1958, Ford would introduce the Edsel to the buying public. So then Ford had 5 divisions, but both the Continental division as well as the Edsel division would be fleeting in terms of the time frame with which they sold products to customers. And, of course, the rest of Ford's divisions would soldier on for a number of years to come. But as I mentioned, in 1956, Ford would launch the Continental division, and it was launched according to an SAE paper that was produced by Ford Motor Company. It was really tasked with 4 main elements when it came to the vehicles that it would produce. Number one, the cars would have not necessarily modern styling, but more classic styling and tasteful styling. Number two, the car was supposed to have a number of technological innovations that would enhance its value as perceived by customers in the areas of safety and quality, as well as performance. Number three is an interesting one, but it was specified that the car was not to have a height that exceeded 58 inches. Remember, this was a time frame in which many cars were still rather tall, although by this point in the later 1950s, that overall height was starting to come down and longer, lower, wider as a design philosophy was starting to take over. And 4, and somewhat contradictory to the other ones, the car was to have the maximum use of Lincoln chassis parts and components. So that's kind of a curious way to start a new car division, but that was what birthed the Continental division, and it was led by William Clay Ford Sr., who was the youngest child of Edsel Ford and the grandchild of Henry Ford. Now let's take a look at this particular 32,000-mile original 1957 Continental Mark II. And one of the things that I will just point out about the design is that this car was designed by a gentleman by the name of John Reinhardt. He was the principal designer of the Continental and was assigned to the Continental Studios. And you have to remember that Continental was actually supposed to be an entire division, and it was supposed to have multiple models, not just the coupe that you saw here, but also convertibles as well as sedans. Of course, the latter never made it into production, probably because the coupe really didn't fare that well in terms of sales. In any case, John Reinhardt was tasked with designing the Continental, and it's kind of interesting. He was an individual that another Ford designer, Dave Ash, who was the creator of the Mustang, kind of remarked that John Reinhardt was somebody who was rather slow and methodical when it came to design, moving in a line an inch here or there, up or down, left or right, to try to get the perfect lines on the car. And in fact, Dave Ash, when he was promoted to lead a special studio at Ford, actually remarked that William Clay Ford tried to force him to rehire John Reinhardt as a member of that studio. But John Reinhardt wasn't interested. At that point, he had left Ford Motor Company and just wasn't coming back. Apparently, the pace was too much for him. So that's who designed this Continental Mark II, somebody who didn't like to move apparently at a rather rapid pace. And I have to say, the car has a number of beautiful elements, perhaps because John Reinhardt took his time. And as you look at the front end of this car, you can see that it really did achieve one of those original goals for the Continental division, that it would take its styling cues from historical elements rather than modern elements. And that's got to be hard for car designers. Remember, car designers want to look forward. They don't want to look backward. And so the design brief was almost to create one of the first retro cars, let's just say. And you certainly see some styling elements here that were retro. Notice that the headlamps are really just integrated into the fenders here, and you have that so-called power dome hood. This car is kind of a modern interpretation of the historic dropped fender look, where you had the fenders as being separate elements from the hood, and you can almost imagine if this hood were taller, you'd have the drop fender look yet again on this car. So it really does blend the modern and the old, I think in a very stately way. I love the grille and the ice cube tray texture of it, let's just call it, as well as the bumper guards, which beautifully flank the front license plate. And I like how the turn signals are incorporated into the bumper. The bumper's kind of squashed down in that area. You also have a line on here that you can see that continues down the body side. And that was something that John Reinhardt added to this Continental Mark II. And Lincoln would later pick up that kind of crease in the side of the car when it came to the Continentals that would be developed later on. Of course, this particular car was called the Continental Mark II because it followed the original Continentals from 1939 all the way through 1948. Now, as we start rotating to the side of the car, you can see that crease better and how it continues down the side of the car, almost like a swage line with that S-curve associated with it. And it does, I think, give some tension to the overall body that you wouldn't have if that were absent. Imagine this car without that, and I think the sides would look a little pudgy and blobby. That at least visually breaks it up a little bit and helps take your eye down the entire side of the car and visually lengthen it as well. And you really start to see in this view some of that, let's say, historical proportions as well. The very vertical and upright passenger compartment here with the upright windshield and the very upright C-pillar, kind of, again, hearkening back to the prior, let's say, true classic cars and how they had very stiff and formal uppers. Nobody was going to call this car a fastback or a two-box design. This is unabashedly and proudly a three-box car, and, well, you got to love it for that. You kind of also come to appreciate the styling of this car and how understated and tasteful that it really is. Remember that Cadillac at this point was really producing cars that were kind of in your face with these huge bumpers with the points on them and a lot of chrome. This is a very tastefully executed car with a minimal amount of chrome. Look how thin the rocker moldings are at the bottom of the car. Everything is just tasteful and understated. The badging is understated. Even the Continental block lettering up front is relatively small and understated. And it just shows the detail with which the designers really took their time on this car, because it's hard to make an understated car look luxurious. But I think this one is successful. There's not even a, let's say, bright work trim around the wheel arches. It's just plain, but it completely works in this car. And you also see, you can see the belt line kind of kicks up, similar to the swage line, that crease on the side. And so it all works together so harmoniously and beautifully. It's just a stunning automobile. Now, as we rotate around to the back, you can see that swage line just fades out beautifully ahead of the tail lamp. You can also see the crown that the C-pillar has. Despite the fact that it's very stiff, it does have this beautiful crown that's continued into the backlight. And then, of course, you notice the Continental, let's say, true element of depicting the Continental style, that faux spare tire trunk hump. Continentals would have that for many, many years to come. That was something that was kind of like the vertical tail lamps on a Cadillac. It was just a signature for the Continental. And, well, here you kind of had vertical tail lamps, but they're a little bit different. By the way, The fuel filler door on these is kind of hidden in the driver's side tail lamp. You move it out of the way and the fuel filler is behind there. So the body sides are completely clean and you don't have a fuel filler door. You also notice the exhausts are tucked into the bumper. Very tasteful and elegant, although exhaust gases are toxic and that would sometimes help rot the bumper away. So I think that was one reason why Ford maybe and others stopped doing that. Now, one thing I will say about this, I don't know if it bothers anybody else. I think this car is beautiful in so many ways, but in this particular view, to me, it looks like the deck lid isn't quite tall enough. It looks like it needs a little bit more height to it. I don't know why. The quarters look fine, but the deck lid itself, something just looks a little off. But maybe that's just me. But as you continue walking around the car, like this rear three-quarter view, the deck lid looks fine. So it's just one of those things that it depends on the angle at which you see it. And that's true of many different cars, that you can see something funny from a particular angle, but you keep walking around it, and then it looks fine, then it looks funny again. It's hard to make a car that as you walk around the entire thing looks perfect. In any case, you can start to see some elements that Ford would pick for the 1961 Continental in this particular view as well. Notably, that rear quarter panel and the form of it, how it's got that kick up there in the belt, that would be replicated in the 61 Continental. And I think the overall kind of Bauhausian style that the car has, this very, very clean, simple quarter panel, was something that you'd see again just a few years later. So while that 61 Continental didn't have necessarily a lot of the design elements that this one did, in fact, it set a new styling direction for Ford in so many ways. It would have a much, let's say, flatter fender profile, much more architectural design than even this one. And it would have the Continental greenhouse with the shoulder between the glass and the outside of the door. There are some elements that you certainly can see in between both vehicles that are shared, mostly from this angle. Now, as we rotate to the interior, you could get the finest of interior materials in your 56 and 57 Continental Mark II. This one has a cloth interior, which you could get. You also could get Bridge of Weir leather, very, very expensive interiors. Continentals were hand-built cars, and Ford Motor Company lost a ton of money on each of them, despite the fact that their price was $10,000, which really was a king's ransom in 1956 and 1957. The equivalent of, let's say, north of $100,000 today. This car was priced to compete with Rolls-Royce and Bentley and be the finest of anything around, finer than Cadillac. Cadillac was, we'll just dismiss Cadillac, except for the 57, 58 Eldorado Brougham, which would be similarly expensive. But again, this car was hand fabricated, and I think the interior is tasteful and very understated. Wait till we see the dash in a minute. It's very clean, elegant, mid-century modern-esque, and relatively unadorned, to be honest, as well, though it does have a full complement of gauges. And here's a picture of a different Continental Mark II, and you can see the very simple gauge pod. By the way, all of the gauges, like the oil pressure and temperature, are in that leftmost gauge pod. Then you have the speedometer, the clock, and then a tachometer. And then all the HVAC controls are down in that pod below near the transmission tunnel hump. By the way, this particular Continental Mark II also has a leather interior, which, leather, cloth really didn't matter. By the way, leather in the old days was what was used for the chauffeur's section of cars. Cloth was what was the rich material in the day. And I guess whomever ordered the other Continental, as you can see here yet again, really wanted the cloth interior and thought it was luxurious. And the back seat certainly was luxurious too. And one other thing you can see here in the headliner, there's this beautiful detail of the vents. This is, by the way, for the air conditioning. Back in this day, you often got air conditioning vents in the headliner. And it kind of made sense because cold air sinks, warm air rises. So it's probably the best place to put the vents. They don't do that anymore really today, except on, let's say, large SUVs and vans. But in general, in cars, it obviously just comes out the dash. But I think here it was pretty effective. Back in this time frame, heater boxes and air conditioning operated separately from one another. So it made sense to kind of separate the systems as well as the vents for them. Now, if there was an area where the Continental Mark II was a letdown, it was really in the engine compartment. And that's because the car doesn't have anything special about the engine. It's basically a standard Lincoln 364 cubic inch V8 with a 4-barrel carburetor, making 285 horsepower. You'd think that Ford would have tried to at least put something special under hood here, but I guess, remember, they were trying to maximize the use of Lincoln chassis components, and so they used the Lincoln engine, the 364 cubic inch V8. And interestingly, William Clay Ford has a Honolulu blue, or had a Honolulu blue Continental Mark II that was his personal Continental Mark II, painted in Honolulu blue, owned by Rick Schmidt of the NPD Parts Depot, National Parts Depot. And that car was retrofitted from Ford with a 460 cubic inch V8 under hood. It has a special distributor such that the distributor has a provision for a mechanical tech in the passenger compartment. So even William Clay Ford wanted some more power in his Mark II, but oh well. The only thing that was really unique about this engine was the fact that it got Continental valve covers, I guess we could say. So that's about it in the underhood department. So what do you think of the Continental Mark II? And what about the price drops on these? I guess I can understand it. The collectors of these 50s era cars and 40s and 30s era cars are literally starting to die off, or there's not all that many of them anymore. But these cars are classics, and I hope that people will continue to appreciate them and enjoy them. I think it's a very, very stately car and one that would make a fun collector. Thanks again for watching.